However you might see it. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to have you all here, and there's lots of friendly faces who I recognise, and it's always lovely to see all of you again. There are also some friends I haven't met yet, which is something I shall look forward to. Today we will be running an event which we sort of practiced last year. So last year we not only did the exhibition, but then we did a short film festival. We have a short film festival coming up on the 13th of April, advance notice. We have a event coming up on the 21st of March, which Lucas will be speaking at, and entitled Nobody's Perfect. And we have today, by the lovely Peter Herbert and the University of Westminster, in the form of myself. My name is Professor Pippa Catterall, and I teach at the University of Westminster, and I'm delighted to have a number of Westminster students in the room, Westminster students represented in the artwork, and so on. So what we're going to do today is show the iconic Marmite So Bad It's Really Good, allegedly, film Glen or Glenda, made by the notorious B-movie filmmaker Edward in 1953. Imagine the scene. This is around the time that Christina Jorgensen came back from Denmark, having transitioned. And you see all these headlines in American newspapers about GI is now a girl and things like that. You have people writing in the aftermath of that in large numbers to Harry Benkerman, former alum of Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft in Berlin, notoriously destroyed by the Nazis when they were practicing, just getting into the hang of book burning on the 6th of May 1933 in Berlin. People writing in large numbers to Benkerman, who fled to New York, about, well, we've seen Christina Jorgensen, could that happen for us as well? And Benkerman goes, well, I really don't know how to respond to all of this. So that's the setting in which we might locate this film on the other side of the Atlantic. We have, in the aftermath of the film, when we're all absorbing it and hopefully having a glass of wine or a soft drink and discussing it, we will be setting up a panel which will feature Zoe Playdon, who is probably the leading historian of trans health and trans history in this country. Author of the award-winning, wonderful The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes, now in the process of turning it into a television series. And we have Simon Croft sitting next to Zoe, who is going to, well, I'm not going to do too many spoilers. I'm just going to introduce people. So, Simon from Gender and Intelligence, and then three wonderful students from the University of Westminster. We have representing postgraduates, Dan at the back, representing master's students, Lucas at the front, and representing undergraduates, we have Eden. And everyone's going to be, I'm sure, absolutely fantastic. So, without further ado, because I've already bored on for longer than I intended, over to you, Lucas, to show the film. Thank you. got, as I said earlier, a distinguished panel. We decided on the, well, I've decided on a running order, but no one's shifted it. So we're going to start off with Zoe. We're then going to move on to Dan, Lucas, Eden, and last but by no means least, we're going to have Simon. So, Zoe, to put us all, hopefully to give us some context of understanding all of this, over to you.
Okay. Well, I'd just talk about two things. First, the film as film, and why it was so badly panned, and secondly, about the medical historical context. My background is I was Professor of Postgraduate Medical Education for 25 years, and currently Professor of Medical Humanities. So, let's have a think about why it was problematic as a film. Well, Edward made it in 4 or 5 days on the cheapest budget imaginable. And our expectation of film is usually that it's a standard 3-act drama. Yeah. So we've got conflict in Act 1, complication in Act 2, and resolution in Act 3. You've got a clear protagonist, a clear antagonist, and they're at odds with each other, and it all ends up happening on passive. So we're wanting the protagonist to have some particular want, a particular goal, which is usually different from what they actually need, internally. So we've got an internal external journey going on. Well, none of that happens in GLEN or GLENDA. What we have instead on the screen is a mass of stock footage, especially the lightning and the traffic, a mass of stock footage, and a huge amount of exposition, voiceover, telling us what's happening. We have none of the dialogue, which would be showing us character development, really. Even in the key scene where it would have been really quite nice to know what Glenn had to say to Barbara, all of that is exposition, exposition, exposition. And then at the end, the producer was unhappy because they'd actually contracted with Edward to make a film that was effectively about Christine Jorgensen, and this, of course, was all about cross-dressing, so they made him tack an extra 10 minutes, the Anne story, onto the end. So the whole thing is kind of broadly in film terms and dramatic terms, a total mess. But what we might do now is to stand back and say, except that this refusal of a conventional dramatic structure, it does position us as an observer of GLEN GLENDA, as a kind of a case study. Yeah? And it separates us, in a way, from what's going on. I don't know if any of you have seen The Zone of Interest.
Oh yes, yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, films like The Zone of Interest or an early German film, The White Ribbon, do precisely that. They don't allow us to enter the lives of the characters. We're positioned as observers, watching, just as the policeman is positioned as an observer, watching Dr. Alton tell the story. So all of Glen's stories are happening off screen, and they're all communicated through these symbolic scenes of buffalo stampeding. and through this very, very long surreal sequence, it takes 15 minutes for that whole sequence, the whole surreal sequence, to play through, which we might a little later on consider, how does that work and what's going on there. But all of these emotional turmoil are communicated symbolically. They happen effectively off screen. So we could want to reclaim GLEN and GLENDA as an avant-garde trans film that, not just in terms of unusual content at the time, but also in terms of a radical dramatic structure. I mean, I think that's about as far as I can go to, excuse what Edward did. Now, if we turn to when he's making this thing, what's happening in the medical trans world? This is a medical film, isn't it? It's like a kind of an informatic film that's telling the audience how they need to understand and respond. Well, what's happening? In 1952, everything's sort of happening. In 1952, an aristocratic trans man, you would call this, corrects his birth certificate in order to be able to marry. And that story goes, as we would now say, they say, viral. Not just across the whole of the UK, but it's recorded and reported in Time magazine in the US, together with a photograph of you. That's on the 12th of September. Then, a few months later, on the 1st of December 1952, we have the New York Daily News headline, "Ex-GI becomes blonde beauty. Operations transform Bronx youth." This is Christine Jorgensen, who, as Joanne Meyerowitz says in her really important book on trans America, she says, "She sailed smoothly into the womanly realm of glamour without going overboard into the camp world of gay male drag." I think that's one of the interesting things about GLEN and GLENDA, is that it refuses the idea that, Glen is in some way a drag artist. There's a clear separation there. There's this focus on the idea of glamour. Now, at the same time, in 1952, same year, the American Psychiatric Association publishes its first diagnostic and statistical manual of registered mental illnesses, DSM-1, and it includes in there transvestism, under the heading of sexual deviation, and including it with homosexuality, paedophilia, fetishism, and sexual sadism. So we're getting something that's now a very deliberate pathologisation. And in 1953, we have, actually in 1952, Harry Benjamin gives a lecture where he makes a clear distinction between what he calls transvestites and what he calls transsexuals. He says, "The male transvestite admires the female form and manners and tries to imitate both with an intensity that varies greatly from case to case." Basically, he says, the difference between that and transsexualism is, while the male transvestite enacts the role of a woman, the transsexualist wants to be one and function as one, wishing to assume as many of the characteristics as possible, physical, mental, and sexual. So at this point, we're getting a separation between the world of cross-dressing and the world of sex change. I do apologise for the terminology. This is one of the trials of being a historian, is that you're locked into the language of the time, if you want to be accurate. But another interesting bit of language, very much at the time, was the early definitions up until that point of being trans. And what we see in medicine is we have the first diagnostic criteria for being trans in 1886. It's viewed as an intersex condition. And that view of trans as intersex continues pretty much uninterruptedly until we get to really the 1960s in the US and the 1970s in the UK. And the commonest term that's used to describe this intersex condition is psychic hermaphroditism. The idea is that the body and the mind have developed differently, differentially, and therefore the person isn't... everything that Dr. Alton says is nonsense, which I should just add in nonsense, you know. And that the person is, as they would say, psychically hermaphroditic. And this was a principle established and that ran for, 70, 80 years, and was the basis on which trans people were treated, was the basis on which Magnus Hirschfeld was treating, the basis on which Alexander Caldwell in the UK was treating. And the only big question, really, was whether everyone, every human being, was actually anatomically, so to speak, bisexual, or whether just some people were. Did everyone contain both male and female characteristics? Was it a university of bisexualism, or was it limited to a few people? That was a big medical discussion. So, if you were trans, really, you were fine, to a degree, legally, anyway. And less so in the US, more so in the UK. But certainly in the UK, up until the 1960s, if you were trans, then you could self-identify, access affirmative, elective affirmative medical care, correct your birth certificate, and live in complete legal equality. And one of the things that Bolton says is, he talks about the sex changes in Europe. There was a big divergence between European and US practice. A lot more happening in Europe, a lot less happening in the US. So when we put those two things together, the expository film and the medical background, what we find is Ed Wood doing his best to navigate into a world where suddenly we're starting to get a certain amount of shift from psychic hermaphroditism being a biological intersex condition to it being a psychopathology. And it's not long after this, 3 years later, we've got John Money and the Hampsons at Massachusetts Institute of Technology beginning to invent the medical idea of gender, and eventually inventing a thing they call the gender gate that kids pass through in their development. If you pass through the gender gate on the right side, then you end up as cis and straight. If you have inadequate parenting, then you don't. But by 1962, 10 years after this film, if you don't go through the gender gate on the right side, there's a solution. Because now you can go to the gender identity clinic at UCLA and be cured with a range of aversion therapies. So he's making this film at really a very, very interesting turning point, both in society and in medical history. I'll stop there.
I think we could spend an awful lot of time talking about the context and the different contexts on both sides of the Atlantic, because, of course, 1953, this is a high point of the Cold War. This is when the Korean War is going on. This is when the American political establishment is obsessed with, is still dealing with the aftermath of McCarthyism and the corollaries of that, such as the Lavender Menace, which is emphasised at that time, and the idea that people who are not conforming to normative society, you can't help noticing and feeling the jarring effect every time they use the word normal in that film, is very much embedded into that notion of what is acceptable within American capitalist society and safe for that world. So I think there are so many different ways in which we can position this in terms of what's actually going on. The other thing I wanted to ask you about before I hand over to Dan, very briefly, is do you think there's a distinction between America and Britain? Because as you say in the book, in Britain up until the 1970s, if anything, it was more trans men in Britain, people like Michael Dillon, who were perhaps visible, rather than trans women. Whereas the Christine Jorgensen case in America leads to there's only one very brief reference to trans men in that film. No references, of course, to non-binary. So do you think there is an transatlantic difference which reflects the way in which it's commodified?
Well, I think the difference, it's all to do with visibility, really. You know, there's all the way through the big point of visibility for trans men came with the Berlin Olympics in 1936, when there were lots and lots of stories about different competitors who were, we don't know. Certainly in England we have Mark Weston, who's a javelin thrower, who competes in the Olympics and, you know, won lots of medals, and who transitions to male. There's then a bit of a fuss because people say, well, this can't be right. If he's a man now, he always was a man. Yeah? But he was competing in women's competitions and winning them then. So that's not fair. And Mark Weston said quite right and gave back the trophies. And they were handed on to the person who would have otherwise had not entered. So there's lots of visibility for trans men all the way through the 30s. Very little visibility for trans women. Certainly, when Christine Jorgensen turns up and decides to make a career, a media career out of being trans, then there's a huge amount of visibility. So it's 1952, in 1953, I think it is. Yes, American Weekly publishes Christine's story in a series of instalments. But in the UK in 1954, just a year later, it's a bit like, you know, how America had Marilyn Monroe, and the UK had its kind of weaker imitation in Diana Dawes. Yeah. Well, just as the US had Christine Jorgensen, in the UK a year later we have Roberta Cloud publishing her life story in the Picture Post in 7 instalments, and getting absolutely raked over the coals by especially the Sunday people for it. And one of the things that's interesting about these attacks on Roberta are that they use the same kind of nonsense, really, fantasy ideas about differences between men and women, cis men and women. As we hear some of them there, you know, Dr. Auckland's talking about she has thin hair like a woman. We shall be coming around to check everyone. In the same way, the Sunday people attacking Roberta were saying things like, this is how you can tell a man from a woman. European men can't grow their hair any longer than shoulder length. It won't grow any longer. That's a biological, scientific fact. And another scientific fact is that women walk by putting one foot in front of the other. Men don't.
They have to make walks.
Well, they don't do it by putting one foot in front of the other.
On that bombshell, I'm going to hand over to Dan to give us a rather different perspective. So, do you want to introduce yourself by talking about your PhD and how that might relate to what we've seen here about attitudes to trans health in the 1950s and how we might think about trans health now?
So obviously I'm one of Pippa's PhD students and I work based from the University of Westminster. And I think about trans healthcare from a legal perspective, which I don't think people often think about. But specifically kind of linking back to what Zoe said, a lot of my work is to do with how gender is percepted and how potentially kind of Zoe talks there about John Money and things like this and the creation of kind of this post-war binary model of transition as it's referred, where we kind of have, which is referenced in that film, where it is the kind of primary sexual characteristics and all of these kinds of things, which is what society kind of believes with regards to what is trans and how can somebody identify and how do you recognise somebody as being male or female or somewhere kind of outside of that. All my research kind of focuses on how, you know, we kind of see it in that film where society does still have that kind of view of, oh, it's genitalia, it's these primary sexual characteristics which makes a person either male or female. But my research is kind of going towards the side of, well, society's moving away from that now. You know, it's no longer, you know, whether or not somebody has a penis or vagina that makes somebody who they are. It is how we perceive them and how that person speaks to us and how we recognise that person that makes them who we are. You know, it's, you know, you don't walk past somebody in the street and say, right, okay, well, what do you have between your legs for you to be able to recognise or respect somebody? We're moving past that now, and I think you kind of can see that within that film. You had that scene where you're talking, where two kind of people are speaking about things, and there was a kind of thing on the screen with the molten piece of metal, and that person was kind of talking about how, oh right, okay, well you've got to think about them as human beings, and like, well that is kind of how society should be working. But then you also have that kind of contrast of, well, there's that massive kind of focus in the film about kind of, oh right, okay, there's that whole scene where somebody's on a surgical table, and it's like, right, okay, well how do those two things kind of mix? How do they kind of contrast? And I feel like that's kind of where we are at with society at the moment, where it's like we have this wide-ranging kind of group of people within society that recognise that, you know, we shouldn't be following things like the DSM, like Zoe mentioned, and stuff like that with regards to how we recognise people. We should be focusing on who people are as human beings. And the kind of first thing that kind of popped into my head there when I was watching the film is, I've spoken to you a lot about this, but those ideas that were put forward by somebody called Ruth Pierce with that kind of contractor from trans condition to trans movement, where kind of views with regards to trans people and trans identities can kind of change. And it's like, we are kind of arguably moving towards that kind of trans movement, but the two kind of coexist in this really interesting way, where you can have those conversations in the film, but then you can also have 10 minutes later this scene where, you know, we're focusing on somebody being on a surgery table, and it's like, right, okay, well, the two kind of approaches to understanding trans people and trans identities, they coexist, but realistically, how well can they coexist, if you get what I mean? Like, we can't have this trans fluid, we can understand, we can evolve our knowledge with regards to the experiences of trans people and trans identities, but then also do things like, you know, show somebody on a surgery table for 5 minutes, because that is not, you know, the essence of being trans. Is not what, you know, what trans identities are. We shouldn't be having that focus. So yeah, a lot of my research is focused on, you know, the kind of link between those and how can we have both at the same time, and which takes preference, and how do we kind of move past that kind of source of conflict in between those. So yeah, that's kind of...
Yeah. I think you just made a really interesting point. Zoe was saying that the film is in many ways, of course, a mess, because it's not the way in which we would expect to see a film, although I think in some ways it is picking up upon a kind of documentary approach. I saw the pioneering Danish documentary film Hexen, made in the 1920s recently, and it kept on reminding me of that, because it kept on having cutaways into these scenes, almost these surreal passages, and of course surrealism really takes off in the 1920s. Surrealism is also there in films made in 52, 53. I mean, another film made in 1953 is Singing in the Rain, which has got a long, kind of surreal sequence with Sid Charest dancing around and so on, in a kind of outside, I put the thing just to please you, Michael, dancing around in a totally different dream setting. But I think that's partly, from what you're saying, Dan, reflective of the difficulties of how you deal with on the one hand, the medical model, which is foregrounded in the film. I mean, it's central to the narrative structure of the film, although you kind of forget it by the time Dr. Alton comes back again. And the way in which, indeed, trans is movement, and the fluidity and the range of if you like, gender fluid expressions fit into the film. I suppose you could say he actually does quite a good job in a difficult circumstance.
And I think one of the interesting things that he set up in there is the contrast between Dr. Alton and the Bela Lugosi character, who, in the credits you'll see, was called the scientist. Yeah. And so we've got these two views of etiology. And for Dr. Alton, it's because, you know, standard overbearing mother who prefers a girl and the absent father and so on and so forth, the attachment theory problems that Glenn had as a child and so on. So Dr. Alton is pushing now towards this psycho-pathologization, whereas Bela Lugosi, the scientist, is very clear that people are just what they are. This is how people come about. He, as fate or God or destiny or what have you, does that, and destiny just, as he says, pulling the string. And so you've got, you know, on the one hand, a deterministic biological etiology, and on the other hand, a psycho-pathologizing etiology, in a kind of a nature-nurture debate, which is going to run and run, a debate that was started by a guy called Francis Galton, Darwin's weird cousin, the inventor of the term eugenics, and indeed of the phrase nature or nurture, trying to account for how people become who they are. And that nature-nurture debate is going to run and run and run. I mean, really, almost up to the present day, in the question of, but what is it that makes people trans, you know? And with the really very uncomfortable subtext of, because if we knew, we could stop it.
Exactly, which is partly there in the final scenes as well, the notion that somehow you get happily ever after, and the notion of cure. Well, I noticed that Lucas is wearing socks which would have looked great on Bela Lugosi in that film, because they were like the iconography of the rather macabre setting Bela Lugosi is speaking to us from. So, Lucas, over to you.
Well, yes, these quick drop about the socks, by the way. They're Edgar Allan Poe themed. It's a small queer business called Foot Clothes. Check them out. Best socks I've ever owned. I'm sure you know by my accent, I'm from America. Watching this movie, definitely felt a lot of the scenes, especially around like pathologizing and the medical aspects of it, really relate to a lot of like American medical history for sure. So I'm gonna give a quick rundown of like American medical history for trans people, and kind of hope that gives a little bit of context to the film. As far as in the US, I know we talked about this a little bit, trans feminine people typically got a lot more access earlier and were more seen as part of our community earlier in the timeline, with a lot of transmasculine people falling to the wayside or the back and being rather forgotten about in the eyes of the public, medical health, etc. Which is why even now transmasculine people struggle a lot more to find access to care. And that also tends to be because there is this aspect of trans feminine care that also can apply to just cis women. But for the most part, transmasculine care, like top surgeries and testosterone, are like items and things that are regulated mostly to transmasculine people. Testosterone in the US is really, really hard to come by, especially because of its ability to be used as a steroid, which I know is the same here. But another really big issue with the US and versus the UK with healthcare is our access to care. It is definitely hard here, and I know it is. But in the US, a lot of places haven't updated their laws. And it really depends city to city, state to state, Where I was, I got very lucky. It was a very open place for trans people. We were able to self-diagnose with gender dysphoria, but in the city, right, like about a 30-minute drive from me, that was a city where it took 6 to 12 months to get diagnosed with gender dysphoria. And you can't start on anything until you get that diagnosis. And that's in a blue state, so a more left-leaning state. When you go to a further Republican state, you have to deal with, just like you see in the movie, more pathologizing of you. There are some places where you have to start socially transitioning for up to a year to 2 years before you're even able to get hormone therapy. Laws are only becoming stricter, which is not great. And then when it comes to things like top surgery and care like that, most doctors for transmasculine people also want you to be transitioning openly for at least 2 to 4 years. Most places want you to have written proof from the doctor that you've been on HRT for at least a year to, again, 4 years, anywhere between there. It depends on the doctor entirely. And in that regard, trans feminine people are a lot more lucky in the States. They can get access to that kind of surgery and care better. Of course, it's expensive because we all have to pay out of pocket, but you can go to a clinic that is meant for cis females, for like, and things like that, and still get the kind of like breast augmentation or laser hair removal and stuff like that, because there is a large population of cis women who do those things. So, for the most part with that, you do not need to get your stuff diagnosed. You do not need to have paperwork on paperwork proving that you are trans, and just to get a breast augmentation or laser hair removal, as opposed to the transmasculine people who do have to fight for that. And yeah, it like I said, it's really dependent on where you are too. And it's one of those things when looking at this movie that a lot of trans people in the US still have to go through is going to a psychologist who will ask all about their experience, their journey, who you are, what you feel, and if they find something that they don't think fits within the gender dysphoria category, you are potentially written off entirely for getting any care. It's a little rougher for transmasculine people than transfeminine in the States, unfortunately.
It's interesting how that's changed. We think that things get better, yes they do in some ways. But back, of course, in the 50s, Christine Jorgensen and Roberta Cow could just simply buy estrogen. And the royal route was that you self-administered estrogen, and then you tipped up with the doctors and said, gosh, doctor, something's happening to me. Doctor, I'm in trouble, goodness gracious me, as Peter Sellers said. My body is naturally feminizing. And you just took it from there. But of course, it's now much more difficult, just as Ruth says, to access HRT just about everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same in Paris for people like Bambi in the 1950s as well. So you could acquire all of these things over the counter, whereas now what you're describing, Lucas, is medical gatekeeping. By and large, and determining what you cannot do. I mean, obviously this also operates within a legalised system which frequently imposes gender norms. So a lot of American states had, and indeed some may still have, either at state or county level, laws where it's illegal to cross-dress in the way that Edward himself did. there are still lots of states in the US where they have laws governing what your hair can look like, which of course is deeply racialised. And in the US we could talk, I mean we could spend a lot of time talking about the racial hierarchies of these kinds of things as well.
Yeah,
So,
most states actually still do have laws about cross-dressing
yeah.
that they've never gotten rid of. It's not common in the states to really get rid of a law so much as ignore it.
Yeah.
I know that my hometown of Denver, Colorado, still technically has cross-dressing laws, just no one talks about them or does anything about them. And it is one of those things where it's like, we could get rid of it, but it's not become a problem yet.
Yeah. Whereas in this country, I mean, I suppose in this country we still do that kind of thing as well. Fools just fall into desuetude, as it were. I was
just going to pick up, because I'm not sure how many people are aware, I'm going to pick up on Luke's point about access to top surgery. There's this kind of strange thing that happens in the UK, where, as you may well know, if you're a cis woman with a familial history of breast cancer, then you can elect for risk-reducing surgery and have a double mastectomy to remove the likelihood of that happening. Well, the gold standard for risk-reducing surgery under those circumstances for a cis woman, the gold standard is one interview with a clinical psychologist to make sure that you understand the consequences of your action and are able to move forward. That's very different from being a trans man. Yeah.
exactly.
And there's this, and a part of me still wonders, but now is the political climate to ask these questions, a part of me still wonders, could you bring a case of sex discrimination then, between cis women and trans men?
Well, we might come back to Dan, who's the lawyer on the panel. But before we do that, we've still got two more panellists, and I should say as well, we will have a Q&A session afterwards in which you can ask any of us questions which we'll try and answer. But next, Eden.
Hello, my name is Eden. I'm an artist and currently studying at the University of Westminster. And I guess I want to continue on with the theme of, this struggle that we face at the moment with accessing healthcare. I can speak from a personal experience that there's been a lot of ups and downs with me transitioning in the last few years. A lot of times where I felt really defeated or feeling like, people aren't listening to me, professionals aren't listening to me, going around in admin circles with NHS. It's the same with, going through the NHS or private. There's always these hurdles I find, and that's the thing that often comes up with trans people I talk to. It's like they don't want us to have, access to this. And it turns out a lot of my work that I make is based around this struggle, this sort of symbiosis between my art and my gender experience. I found it really interesting in the film about, they were saying that Glenda was a kind of character that Glen made. And it made me think about myself in the past, where I was kind of figuring out my own gender identity, my identity as a trans man. And it's kind of been, just recently I've realised, ever since I was a kid, a lot of the drawings and pictures and figurative drawings I made, I was trying to, embody on paper what I didn't feel like I could embody myself, because I was too young or, didn't quite understand what it meant to be trans yet. But, when I was a kid, I was always drawing, very androgynous characters, kind of creating these different realities for myself on the page that, I couldn't yet embody myself. And, thankfully these days I've started hormones and I'm raising money for my own top surgery, and, these things I used to imagine, these characters, are now becoming a reality for myself, which is, a beautiful process of transformation, which, it's tough when all of that gets I don't know, shadowed over by how difficult it is a lot of the time and how emotionally taxing it is. Let me just look at my notes. I think that kind of trying to represent the inner experience of being trans and that turmoil, it continues throughout my work. I have some paintings displayed in the gallery over there of myself wearing this face mask, which is kind of, it's dripping off my face. I'm kind of unsure whether to hold it to my face or not, because I wasn't sure if I wanted to let go of this mask, at risk of being not accepted. Like how Glenn, feared that his wife would not love him if she found out his secret. I think that's a big fear. So the work in the gallery over there, I think it's a lot about that kind of anxiety of, should I not repress this anymore? Should I embody this imaginary life that I've been dreaming of, or should I kind of keep quiet and keep it hidden away? A lot of my work is about that kind of process, those interior realities of being trans, those, maybe not representing, visually what the experience is like, but really what's going on inside. Inspired a lot by surrealists, so I found that surrealist sequence quite interesting. I don't know, I feel like it was kind of showing more what was going on in his mind and maybe his past experience, rather than anything real, which I think, that's what I'm really inspired by in my work. The movie, although there was, a lot of things that today is not really something we'd agree with, such as, the ending of Glenda, them implying that Glenn could just transfer these feelings onto his wife. I don't know if that really that's really acceptable these days to put out there as a notion. But despite it being made in 1953, there's still elements of the film that I could find myself relating to, such as when they're talking about Glenda being, when Glenn's at home, he becomes Glenda, and that's why he's comfortable and happy. And I could relate to that, because in my experience, that gender exploration happened in private before I could expose it to the rest of the world. So I think that was just a little snippet of something I really resonated with in the film. But I think that's all I've got to say right now.
Thank you. I wondered whether that resolution, as it were, which is a kind of let's have a fairy tale ending, as it were, is put in at the behest of the studio. Because, as Zoe said, that the studio clearly have an impact on it, and to satisfy the expectations of the audience at the time when there is this sense of anxiety. One of the things which I think you just said, which was really interesting, trenches upon the concept of masquerade, and the notion that somehow trans people are masquerading, and that the word is actually used, monster, in the film, and the notion that therefore we are, it's not what we're trying to pass. I find the whole notion that we have to pass is something which is imposed upon us. Whereas if we were accepted for who we are, we wouldn't have that problem anyway. The whole notion that you're masquerading is imposed upon you by society. Also, don't cis people masquerade as well? Have you ever met any politicians? People who have so many different personalities, it's almost like talking to a matroican dog. So I think we have to be really clear that whole notion of masquerade is something which has to be pushed back on. Indeed, this is my segue into our final speaker. Simon comes from an organisation called Gendered Intelligence, which works to support people and advise people and provide information for organisations who are really struggling to get their heads around all of this kind of stuff. So I've participated in training programs that Gender Intelligence is doing, and you listen to some of my colleagues and you go, did you really just say that? Are you But Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, my name's Simon. I'm the Director of Professional and Educational Services at Gender Intelligence. I'm also an artist here. My artwork, No Game, is the Snakes and Ladders piece in the alcove there, and that's very much talking about the parlour state of access to trans healthcare in the UK at the moment. But with my Gender Intelligence hat on, just to expand a little bit on what Pippa was saying, we offer a lot of services direct to trans people, a lot particularly focused around young trans people up to the age of 25. We do youth groups, residentials. We've also got a support line for people looking to access healthcare for those who are 18 plus, well actually 17 plus. If anybody needs that, the information is by the artwork. And we also have some things for older people as well, so we've just started up a 50 plus trans feminine group as well. The bit that I look after is our training and consultancy that Pippa mentioned, and we also have a public engagement team, a small public engagement team, which acts to raise awareness, engage with the media, engage insofar as we can manage to at the moment with politicians, etc., and to respond to consultations that are out there. So it's really interesting to see a film like this. Pippa asked you to say a little bit about how that perhaps we might still see some of that resonating today, some of the things that we might be seeing there, and a bit about what's currently going on for trans people as well, and especially in terms of bringing that back to health, thinking about how that really is impacting on trans people's mental health at the moment. And it's true that a number of these narratives that we saw in the film are still very much circulating. People have touched on the notion of pathologisation, of medicalisation, of gatekeeping, some of the notions of what really counts in terms of, are we looking at biological essentialism, which is certainly something which has been used to oppress just about every marginalised group in one way, shape or form. And also what we saw in the film is kind of how the media might really plaster this all over unsympathetic headlines, and that's still something that we see very much continuing today, and that remains extraordinarily harmful to people. And I think some of these narratives have actually, they've perhaps faded away a little bit, but they've really resurged in recent years. And they contributed to what I was listening to a talk by Judith Butler at LSE literally just 2 days ago on Thursday evening. And they described it as the accelerated normalisation of rights stripping. And that phrase really, really resonated with me, because they were talking about it not only in relation to trans people, but in relation to many, many marginalised groups. And I think what we're seeing is the media and right-wing people and parties, etc., whipping up this kind of frenzy of excitement and it causing indignation in people, resulting in calls to deny people their rights. And the government is very much following that line. And of course, it's not only affecting trans and non-binary folks, as I said, it affects all LGBTQI plus people, it affects all women and girls, it affects all black people and people of colour, migrants, disabled people, pretty much anybody who is marginalised by those white patriarchal systems. And again, we saw some of that, it's a film that's in and of its time, and we saw in that film things like blatant racism, which we should name in relation to that, sexism, sexual abuse, we're seeing all of those things in that film. And we're still seeing these same narratives of things like the monstrous, the deviant, the unsafe, which we were talking about, other speakers have talked about today as well. You've only got to look at recent events to see these things coming through in real kind of practical and visceral terms. We're seeing young people, young trans people being stabbed or murdered in our country. We're seeing the Prime Minister making transphobic jokes in Parliament. And interestingly, those jokes have been made in Parliament for a long time. The only thing that's brought them to attention and brought them out and brought them to the fore and put any media attention on them at the moment is that he made this last one in front of the parent of a murdered trans child. The Department for Education has issued draft guidance for schools, which is basically setting a baseline of exclusion for young trans people, not inclusion, and also of not supporting them. So not only is there, there is gatekeeping, it's almost setting a bar of no gate for them to walk through. And the EHRC, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, the very group intended to champion the rights of marginalised groups itself, has set out within, I think it's probably about a year ago now, how trans women can be excluded from the category of women. So all of these things are kind of happening at the moment. This is, it's shocking, it's shameful, but it feels almost like the new norm that we as trans folk might be living under. And that impact is huge. So I mentioned earlier that Gendered Intelligence does a lot of work with young trans and non-binary and gender questioning people. And when I spoke recently with our Director of Youth and Community Services, he said that we saw more serious mental health related safeguarding incidents in the first quarter of last year than we did in the whole of the previous year. So those issues of mental ill health, particularly amongst our young trans people, but people of any age are not immune, it's skyrocketing. And it's really a crisis point. And I think when we're looking at what's happening at the moment, we are particularly seeing trans women and trans feminine people, and especially trans women who are black and people of colour, are very much bearing the brunt of this. That intersectional marginalisation is having a huge impact. So what's important, really, at this time? So I think there's sort of 2 or 3 points I might draw out. One is, it's time for allies to stand up and be vocal. We can all be allies to different groups of people, and trans folk very much need other people, including within the LGBT community, to stand up for us. Silence is not allyship at this point in time. We know, heading up the training department at Gendered Intelligence, I know that the vast majority of people that we go out, we do training for, that we consult with, are kind, decent people who don't want to willingly harm another person and will act to try and make things a little bit better. And the vast majority of people have no issue with trans people at all. But I think it's silence that is one of the key things that's allowed this situation to fester. And if politicians, as Pippa was saying, who have many different faces, if they realise that transphobia is not a vote winner, then they will change their tune. I think secondly, it's support, direct support to anybody that you happen to know who is trans, non-binary, gender questioning. Support your trans friends, your family, your colleagues. Offer a listening ear. Try not to place additional demands on them at this time when they are so much under stress. Please don't ask them to educate or explain. Do the work yourself. There's plenty out there, or via places that are specifically set up to take on that work, like Gendered Intelligence. And understand, if they're frightened to go out, which people are, it doesn't feel really safe on the streets anymore, then I think offer to stay in with them rather than go out without them. It's those kinds of things that can make a huge difference. And also, please be vocal about improved support in whatever settings you might have a foothold in, whether that's employment or education. Ask, does your employer or your institution have a trans inclusion policy? Do they implement it? Simple things like that. Asking, looking, have they got some, a diverse range of toilets so people feel safe to use them? You can ask those questions. And whether that's in leisure or sports settings as well. Also things like you could do, responding to the consultations that are out there, like the Department for Education thing that I mentioned earlier. That consultation is still open to the 8th of March. And I think this is contributing to those things is what makes a better world for everybody, because gender is something that affects each and every one of us in one way, shape or form. And if we can work to remove some of those stereotypes, all of those kind of historical tropes, those different ways that we are all constrained in relation to gender, then it's going to be a big step forward. So in relation to Gendered Intelligence, do follow the organisation on social media. That will keep you up to date. It will give you those opportunities and support if you are trans and non-binary yourself, or you know somebody who might need signposting. And it also gives maybe some thoughts for allies. You'll find out about things where you could maybe contribute, make a difference. And obviously, if anybody wants any information or references or links or anything like that, just grab me after the session. I'm more than happy to help.
Thank you very much. One quick swift observation on that is that the Tories are clearly now also going after Muslims, as we've seen over the last couple of days, and it is very important to support all of those people who are marginalised, and there is quite a deliberate process of demonisation. And it looks like it's quite coordinated as well, presumably to try and shore up their vote, the vote that they're hemorrhaging to the Reform Party. But with the consequence that, as a friend of mine who works for Stop Hate UK pointed out to me some years ago, every time someone like Priti Patel, Cruella Braverman or Rishi Sunak opens their mouth and demonises people, people get hurt. Because it creates exactly the situation Simon's just identified, where you're going, it's socially approved, it's okay to beat up someone who's trans, who's gay, or who's Muslim, or whatever, and it certainly should never be. I think our panel has done a fantastic job of telling us about the film, and so much more as well. So can you join me please in thanking them? Earlier, we have some time for questions. I've already asked loads of questions, so you don't want to hear anything more from me. Are there any questions from the floor? Yes.
I'd like you to have added anti-Semitism as well as the other list. It's a huge, as we all know.
I agree,
Yeah.
and I was going to mention it, except that the Tories have not mentioned that in the last 2 days. But
Well, I don't give a fuck what the Tories do.
No,
You could have done it.
I know. So we'll add anti-Semitism as well, because that's absolutely right.
Right, thank you. Enough.
And on my way here, I passed a Palestinian demonstration, and I was very conscious of that. So no, I absolutely agree with you, and I apologise for not mentioning it. So
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about regarding the recent, I think it was 2 years ago.
I can't hear a word. Can't hear you. We can't hear you.
I'd like to ask the panel about what happened 2 years ago when the Tavistock and Portman Clinic, some of the services, there was a lawsuit from ex-patient, which I think the complaint was about the puberty blockers being distributed to them too early. And the decision that followed that they kind of lost the services they could provide to trans people, and they were moved to, I think, Great Ormond Hospital, to the children services. And I just wonder whether anyone from the panel followed that situation, and whether that was good or damaging to the trans community, whether what followed. Because in a way I'm kind of thinking that the Tavistock Portman is, and I was a patient of that clinic, I'm not a trans person, but they specialize in providing therapeutic work and support. And maybe it was a good decision that those services moved away, because this is the psychopathology of it was kind of moving away, the trans. Yeah, I don't know whether any of the panel has any comment on that. And also, whether there's any kind of better understanding of what happened. But
I'm happy to talk.
do you want to do that? Do you want to speak to that? So Zoe first.
Okay, so for those who don't necessarily remember it, this is the case that was known as Bell versus Tavistock Clinic. It was a person, Kira Bell, who complained that she'd been inadequately advised and had therefore elected for bilateral mastectomy, and she wished that she hadn't. She was a so-called regretter, and on the basis of that, she felt that the Tavistock had been inadequate. It was a problematic case from the start, because in the UK, just so you know the medical framework, in the UK, cross-sex hormones can't be prescribed until someone is 16, and surgery can't be given until they're 18 and an adult, and therefore out of the Tavistock. So in fact, Bell's procedure that she was complaining about happened after she'd left the Tavistock, when she was an adult and entitled to make that decision. However, it has to be said that for a long time, child and adolescent services had been a Cinderella service. They were started back in the 1980s at St George's Hospital by a guy called Domenico Ceceli. They then transferred to the Tavistock, where they were led by Polly Carmichael. They were hugely underfunded, hugely. And the way it works is you've got a choice. You can either be treating patients or you can be running research studies. Yeah? But if you're going to treat patients, then you would need extra staff and extra funding to run research studies, or you're going to run your research study at the expense of not treating patients. And it was particularly problematic with the children because kids have a ticking clock around puberty. So, although the Tavistock would have liked to be able to run, research programs, they were never in that position, especially because referrals suddenly went up. And they went up kind of exponentially all of a sudden. That's the background. They go to court. Medicine always does badly in law. Broadly because in medicine, you're dealing all the time with uncertainty. You never know. Very little medicine is a matter of knowing an etiology, being sure about diagnosis, able to prescribe with accuracy and predict an outcome. Very little, indeed. Acute cases, yes, broken arms and so on, by all means. But most other medicine, it depends very much on the individual physiology. So medicine is all about it depends. But the law, by its nature, is all about yes or no. Yeah? And so the case went through a series of iterations of appeals. It focused on the administration of puberty blockers. Puberty blockers, can I just say there's nothing in trans healthcare, nothing, that isn't used in cis healthcare. And usually for a lot longer and a lot easier access than cis healthcare. So puberty blockers have been used for a long time for a range of conditions, most notably something called precocious puberty, where kids start to hit puberty at a very early age. They're viewed as being reversible. They simply delay puberty. There can be contraindications. It's nothing, like any other drug or any other intervention. You don't do it lightly. You take aspirin you need to think about. But it's a reasonable path to go, especially since there's a lot more evidence and a lot more research evidence from Holland especially and the US too, that's kind of saying that this is a good thing. Anyway, the court decided that puberty blockers shouldn't be, the kids couldn't give consent to puberty blockers, and so puberty blockers suddenly were stopped. Then parents appealed and said, well, what's the court got to say about this? If the doctor, the parent and the child all agree on puberty blockers, what's the judge got to say about it? And that was reversed eventually. But meanwhile, a large-scale review of the Tavistock and its processes was undertaken. That was partly instigated by some members of the team who had been recruited, who were hardline Freudians. Yeah? They believed everything came from attachment in childhood to either attachment to the mother, attachment to the father, and an inadequate disengagement from those influences. Sounds a bit like fun. Yes, very much so. I mean, Freud's got a lot to answer for in that sense. In any event, the CAST review said, and she said rightly, that the clinic was underfunded, that they hadn't therefore been able to carry out the kinds of research
programmes that you would normally expect to see accompanying their kind of clinical work, and that there needed to be a review and a reorganisation, and that in particular there needed to be more than one centre in the UK. Not least because, you know, if you live in Newcastle on Tyne, it's a long way to come for an appointment, and expensive, you know. And all of that was fine, it would have been a good thing, except that the relocation and the reconfiguration of the service hasn't actually happened. So at closure, there were around 1,000 patients being seen. There are no new appointments being given at the moment, or not since closure. There are no statistics being given to us around how many people have asked for appointments and been unable to get them. But the waiting list is now estimated at 5 to 6 years. Yeah. Puberty blockers can now only be prescribed as part of a formal research framework, which is, you know, always would have been a good thing if only there'd been the funding and the ability to do it. And here's the kicker. The NHS advises that if parents, or the kids themselves, access HRT or blockers from private providers that aren't approved by the Care Quality Commission or the NHS, then the parents may be subjected to child safeguarding issues, the kids taken away from them by family court. So, what we're seeing is this really interesting division, really according to wealth. If you're wealthy, yeah, and you can afford to take your kid to a private GP and access puberty blockers privately and not interface with the NHS, who might frown on that, then you and your kids are safe, they're not going to family court. If you can't, and you do think, well, look, this is hopeless, I'm going to go over to Holland to see Peggy Cohen-Ketris, or over to Boston to see Norman Stack, and then take my kid and get treatment there, then when you get back and take the kid to your local GP, you may find them bringing up social services to report you for child abuse. So it's very, very, very dark times for trans kids and their families right now. And the big question is, given that we have a whole division of the NHS which is devoted to nothing but service reconfiguration, we're always having to reconfigure, why is this taking so long? Why hasn't it happened? Where's the money? Where's the resource? Where's the action? And crucially, where are the appointments for all these kids and their parents?
Dan, and then the ladies at the back.
Women.
Women, all
Yeah,
right.
not
so
ladies.
Whatever you say.
Yeah, that's what I said.
I think my main kind of perception, like what you were asking about whether or not you think it was good or not, I think it definitely could never be seen as good. But I think the really harmful thing that happened with the Bell case was that it's really played into this view that's put forward by politicians and put forward by society that there's this exodus of trans people which are going to their GP on a Monday and then they're having mastectomies on a Friday. And I think it's, you know, every trans person in the room will know that that is possibly the furthest from the truth. That, you know, that isn't what happens. You know, you've got people...
For anything really.
Absolutely not. I mean, like what you said, Zoe, is like, at the minute, I think it's the gender clinic based in Newcastle, you've got a 6.5 to 7 year waiting list for just your first appointment, and it's not just a first appointment where you get a surgery date, you then have your second, and then you have everything that you have to go through in between those to be able to actually access that surgery. Like, what if you're waiting 5 to 6 years for that first appointment, we're talking potentially what, you could be thinking 10 to 12, you know, depending on how things go, before you're actually able to afford that surgery, and it all links back to that idea of wealth. Where it's like, you know, you see this kind of mass amount of trans people now which are having to use things like GoFundMe and things like that to be able to afford to just do the things which the NHS should be doing for them. And if you have a look, like you said again, with regards to cisgender people, you know, it's not unheard of that cisgender women will undergo mastectomies. You know, you have one kind of interview with somebody and you do it. It's the exact same thing with HRT. If you're a woman of a certain age going through menopause, you go to the GP and you're able to be prescribed with HRT, and it happens very quickly. If you have the money, you can do it, but there's this massive inequality, and I think society is being morphed towards this view, and you see it every day in the news. It's like, right, okay, well, we need to be careful of this, we need to be careful of this, protect the children. It's like, well, actually, no, if you were trying to protect the children, what you would be doing is you wouldn't be shutting down the only dedicated gender identity clinic for under 18s. You would be reforming it, you'd be putting the money into it that it requires. And it's like, I feel like it's kind of that weird, you're saying that you need to protect the children, you're saying that all this needs to be done to protect the children, but you're not actually doing things which are going to protect the children. You're actually doing things which are going to make them worse off. You're doing things which are causing trans youth to self-harm, commit suicide, and things like this. And it's like, it's all about protecting the children until you're actually meant to be doing the thing which will help them out. It doesn't make any sense. So yeah, I think the Bell case, it's been very, very harmful because what it's done is it's fed through and it's provided legitimacy to the kind of growing threat that doesn't exist, which everybody's been told. And unfortunately, we live in a society, especially in this country, but kind of across the globe now, where people aren't willing to do the reading, do the research on what things actually are. As long as somebody like GB News or The Sun puts it on a, front page of a newspaper, they're going to believe it and they'll walk along with whatever is said, and it's just not the case. So yeah, I think it was very, very harmful.
Yeah.
So over to you.
Hi. First thing to say is I think that probably what I'm about to say, most of the audience, most of the panel will disagree fundamentally with what I'm going to say. I've been around sexual politics for 50 years plus. I spent a lot of my early youth in GLF with trans people as well, and have fought for trans rights for many a long year. However, I do happen to think that, well, I think lots of things that all of you have said, because I can't keep up with so many issues that come up. I totally agree with you, both of you too, about the private medicine buys you what you want, buys you what you need, whether you're trans or non-trans or anything else, yeah? But I happen to think...
And the reputation of Ed Wood, that he's the worst director in the world, I don't really carry. I think he's an unusual man with a point of view, something to say, and even with poverty-road budgets, he is a bit more of an auteur as a filmmaker, and I think you very rightly put the perspective of what we've all been discussing coming out of quite an extraordinary film. So I just want to thank you, but thank the panel for extraordinary things that you said that many of us have learned from, I would say. And I thank you very much to everyone coming and being part of today.
Thank you.
I think as Peter said, that's kind of a good way of wrapping up the Q&A. We can, of course, continue conversation. There's still some drink over there, but it remains for me to thank everyone, but also to say we have got another event coming up on the 21st of March, which is called Nobody's Perfect, which is about LGBT healthcare and history. Lucas will be speaking at that again. And we've also got the film festival on the 13th of April. And so we hope we'll see some of you at those events again. Otherwise, thank you all very much.